Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Israelis and Palestinians are experiencing some of the worst violence in the region in 7 years. But sadly, it's part of a pattern that few people see an immediate end to. Talk of a peace process is now remote, with many dismissing the idea of a two-state solution altogether. Many rights groups have given up on the notion of a nation for the Palestinians and instead are asking for them to be given basic rights as citizens, be it in Israel or Palestine. So where does this leave committed peaceniks like Gershon Baskin, a Zionist, a peace campaigner, a left-of-center activist in an increasingly right-wing Israel? Hello and welcome, Gershon.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world.
Well, it's great to see you. You're in Jerusalem, but just to know your situation. Obviously, it's a fearful time, particularly if you're near Gaza. But what's the situation like where you are, where you live at the moment?
I live in Southwest Jerusalem, and other than on the first day of this recent war, we have not been hit and we're not targeted. I don't travel to the north or the east of Jerusalem these days because of fear of street violence, which is a problem in any place where there's a meeting point between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians. So I've been wanting to go and visit a Palestinian friend in Northeast Jerusalem, and we've simply put off our meeting until things calm down a bit.
Yeah, no, it's pretty appalling and in some ways unprecedented. I mean, as we're recording, this is not unprecedented. The IDF is still shelling Gaza. Hamas and other Palestinian groups are firing rockets into Israel. The Palestinian death toll is over 200, almost half of them women and children, 12 dead in Israel as we speak, including 2 children. Appalling as it is, I just want to talk in part about what's happening in the region at the moment and draw back a bit to talk about the so-called peace process. It's a term itself that even seems like a misnomer, if ever there was one. But before we do that, can we just say how the latest period of violence erupted? Israel had elections, the 4th in 2 years. Benjamin Netanyahu was struggling to form a government, and at the same time, there were controversial evictions of Palestinians taking place in East Jerusalem. So just take us back 10 days or so, just to describe that situation then, Gershon.
Right. I think it's important to start and say that the root cause of all of this is the continuation of the occupation and the failure to have an Israeli-Palestinian peace. And that has to be out there because the situation is one that's been going on for quite a long time. It erupts every few years or so with another round of violence that's sparked by a combination of factors, and that's what you're asking. What were the combination of factors that led to this recent flare-up? One is of course, Netanyahu, who's been struggling to form a government now unsuccessfully. He has essentially lost 4 rounds of elections, as opposed to what he and his colleagues in his own political party say is a victory, because they get more votes than anyone else, but all the other votes combined are more than what he gets. And all the other votes combined are people who don't want him to continue to be prime minister, and we can't seem to get rid of him. I'm mentioning this because in the summary of where we are right now, what we have is an accumulation of Netanyahu victories that we can point to, and I'll get to that in a moment. This last period was the holy month of Ramadan, the holiest month of the year for Muslims. It's always a very sensitive period. It's always extremely sensitive, in particular with regard to the Al-Aqsa compound, which is also called the Temple Mount. The Aqsa compound is the raw, open nerve of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And when one side or the other acts independently, unilaterally, and pinches that nerve, it sets off flames throughout the conflict area. So we had a series of events that took place during the month of Ramadan. The first one was on Israel Holocaust Memorial Day, when the Chief of Staff of the Army gave a speech in front of the Western Wall, which is just below the Al-Aqsa compound, and the Israelis unilaterally shut down the speakers, the loudspeakers of the mosque compound. That was a unilateral action. Had it been done in coordination with the Waqf, it would have passed by. They would have shut it off for an hour. They would have turned it back on. But when Israel acts unilaterally and enforces itself, imposes itself in the Muslim holy places, we have a spark. During that same period, in the first day of Ramadan, the Israelis blocked off the entrance to the Damascus Gate, which is the largest gate of the old city of Jerusalem, the main gate entering the Muslim quarter. And it was portrayed throughout social media and in the Palestinian press and around the Arab and Muslim world that Al-Aqsa was in danger, that Israel was going to prevent Muslims from going to pray at the mosque during the holy month of Ramadan. And that set off a spark. This notion, Al-Aqsa is in danger, is a slogan that's been used in the Palestinian and Muslim world since the 1920s. It was at the root also of the Second Intifada back in September of 2000, after the visit of Ariel Sharon. The rumors was spread out that Israel intends to take over the compound, to divide the mosque, to build a synagogue on the Temple Mount, etc. Then we had the Sheikh Jarrah issue. Now, it's important to point out that what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah is going on in Silwan and in other neighborhoods in Jerusalem, and it's a process that's been going on for more than 10 years. Nothing new was supposed to happen except that the High Court was having a hearing on the claim of the homeowners, the Palestinians, that the Jewish landowner claim was not valid. It wasn't even that the court was going to make a final decision. This is actually the first time that the issue has come to the High Court. And when it went to the lower courts in Israel, they only ruled on the legal issue of the land ownership documents.
Yeah, just to clarify, Gershon, for those who don't know, we're talking about East Jerusalem. We're talking about Israelis who've bought the land rights or have claim to the land for some time. But you've got Palestinians living in those areas and basically being evicted from their homes. And
right, it's not only Palestinians just living in the area. The Palestinians who are living there were given the land and the homes by the Jordanian government before 1967, and they themselves were refugees from what is currently Israel or West Jerusalem even. Yeah. When they received the rights to those lands and homes, they gave up to the Jordanian government their refugee rights.
So you've got multiple flashpoints you're talking about here. Right. You've got the coronavirus taking place. I think everyone listening to this will know about basically the long-term deprivation within Gaza, within the West Bank, the no elections for a very long period of time, this sense of growing frustration. I was reading an ICG support report back in 2015 saying that Israelis saw the status quo as manageable, and right. He said that's an incredibly dangerous thing to say, because if you think that's going to lead to stability, you're very much mistaken. So that's the background.
There's an additional factor that's important to mention also, is that the Palestinians had actually finally come to a decision to hold elections, and the last time elections were held was in 2006. And the negotiations for the elections were done by emissaries of Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinian Authority and the two senior leaders of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar and Salah Haruri, who came to a renewal of the reconciliation talks between Fatah and Hamas, where they agreed that the outcome of elections would determine whether or not they could reunite the Palestinian political family. And they had decided on 3 rounds of elections. The one that were supposed to take place during the end of May were the elections for the Palestinian Legislative Council. That's the legislative body of the Palestinian Authority governing the West Bank and Gaza. The second round of elections was to be held in the end of July for the president of the Palestinian Authority. And the third round, scheduled for August, is supposed to be for the Palestine National Council, which is the governing body of the PLO, of the Palestine Liberation Organization, that governs Palestinians all over the world, from Palestine and the diaspora. And Mahmoud Abbas had demanded that Israel allow Jerusalemites, East Jerusalemites, 350,000 people living in East Jerusalem, to participate in those elections, and Israel never responded to the request. So Mahmoud Abbas decided to cancel the elections. Now, the calculation is, or what people believe, is that Abbas believed that Hamas would win the elections, and he had the excuse of Jerusalem to cancel them. If there's one thing that Palestinians agreed on across the board, wherever they were, inside of Palestine, outside of Palestine, in West Bank and Gaza, was that there needs to be new elections. that the old leadership that hasn't been elected for so many years needs to be changed. And the canceling of the elections was a blow both to Palestinian democracy and to Palestinian unity.
Mm.
And this is also a major factor that led to the blow up now. Because if Hamas, I believe Hamas would have lost those elections. There were 36 Palestinian lists that were being presented in the elections. It was a festival of Palestinian democracy. Hamas believed that they would win the elections. And they were, in my estimation, at one of their lowest points of popularity before the war. And I would say today, at this point, in the 9th or 10th day of this war, they are more popular than they have ever been.
So you essentially see Hamas as launching. That was going to be my next question. What was Hamas's motivation for this, for getting involved, essentially launching this war?
Well, Hamas wanted to gain the support of the West Bank and Gaza and of the Palestinians inside of Israel and the Arab world by posing that this war is essentially about defending Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem. And they used Al-Aqsa, the riots that took place on Al-Aqsa during Ramadan, and of course the Sheikh Jarrah issue as an example, claiming that Israel is Judaizing Jerusalem and planning to take over Al-Aqsa.
Yeah, okay. I want to sort of delve into where this leads us in terms of, what we talked about, the two-state solution in a second, but let's just talk about what's going on at the moment. Is there pressure within Israel at all to stop the government from launching the barrage of airstrikes and artillery bombardments?
The pressure is much more from the public to continue, to get a decisive victory, to create the deterrence, to go after the terrorist leaders, as they call them, the heads of Hamas, the number one military commander of Hamas, Mohammed Deif, to have something that Israel can have the decisive victory so that they can ensure that Hamas won't think again about shooting rockets at Israel.
Okay, now let's talk about the situation within Israel itself among Palestinian communities, you might call them Arab Israelis. You talked about not being able to go travel around as you'd like normally within Israel. Just tell us what's been happening there. There's obviously been news coverage.
Yeah, we've had an explosion of intercommunal violence between Jews and Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, particularly in the mixed cities, Ramle, Lod, Akko, Jaffa, Haifa. These are the communities where it was believed for so many years that there's a form of decent coexistence between the communities, and the Gaza war, what was going on in Jerusalem and Ramadan, all these factors came together also to let loose a flame of violence that was under the surface for a very long time. The Arab leaders inside of Israel, the political leaders, the members of Knesset, have been screaming for years that there is an abundance of illegal weaponry and gang wars. We have seen murders taking place within the Palestinian Arab communities in Israel for the last years that compete with the rate of murders that took place in New York City in the 1970s. This has really gotten out of control. The problem is that 90% of the murders are not resolved by the police. They don't find the murders, they don't bring them to justice. Whereas if an Arab were to kill a Jew, the murderer would be caught within 48 hours.
But at the same time, I mean, you're talking these are sort of ghettos of criminality, but there's the rifts with they don't serve in the IDF. There's a sense of deprivation. There's the funding that Arab communities get is marginal compared to Israeli.
There has been a significant increase in the amount of funding, and that was actually advocated by Netanyahu. A lot of it didn't end up getting spent, but there was allocations of huge amounts of money over the past years to try and close some of the gaps. And we've seen gaps close. There's an enormous rate of university students in the Israeli universities from the Palestinian Arab communities in Israel. Something like 32% of the students at the Technion, Israel's technical university, are Palestinian Arab students. And the majority of the Palestinian Arab students in the Israeli universities are young women, which is also quite remarkable. So there has been progress and there has been closing of the gaps. The problem is that a lawlessness has developed within these communities, much like within the ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel. There's a kind of autonomy. Only the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, are part of the system, are part of the government, and the Arabs aren't. And Mr. Netanyahu has engaged in a process of delegitimation of the Arab community for years and their representatives in the Knesset. In the 4 rounds of elections that we've held in the last 2 years, the Arab parties that were elected by more than 90% of the Arab public were completely delegitimized. They could not be part of coalition negotiations, and no one in the Israeli political scene who had a chance of being part of that government from the right wing, center right, would include the Arabs. So, and this has been part of a whole process of incitement against the Arab community. So this is all part of the explosion that took place, but nonetheless, it's important to point out that the violence that was done over the last 10 days in these communities only represents a 1 or 2% of the Arab community. They don't have the public with them, but no one can control them, except now the Israeli police have a massive presence in these communities. And finally, the Israeli government and the police are talking about dealing with all the illegal weapons that are there. And I'll remind everyone that most of these illegal weapons were stolen or sold by Israeli soldiers. They came from the Israeli army. That's how these weapons got into these communities and are held by gangs.
It must be a deeply depressing time for you. I can see your book over your left shoulder, your right shoulder, sorry, which is In Pursuit of Peace in Israel and Palestine. You've got it there, which I gather from you, Gershon, is now out in Portuguese and soon to be published in Arabic.
It was published in Arabic. It was published by a publishing house in Jordan and in Lebanon, and it's being sold in the Arab world. And it was published now in Brazil, and I'm in the process of translating a new edition into Hebrew.
I think it's great to be talking to you at this time, but basically it must be deeply depressing for you. If you look at, we've been traveling in the region for a decade now, and things have got worse, not better. If we look, I was looking at the 2 reports that came out earlier this year, one from B'Tselem, followed closely by Human Rights Watch, that essentially called Israel and its control of the Palestinian communities an apartheid state, a state that prioritizes its Jewish citizens over Palestinians, be they Israeli citizens or be they Palestinians living within the occupied West Bank. Is that something you agree with? Is that something you?
Look, the reality is that Israel defines itself as the democratic nation state of the Jewish people. The reality is that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, we have basically a 50-50 split of population of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. At which time it is no longer possible, I think, to continue to call ourselves seriously the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, because 50% of the people living here between the river and the sea are not Jewish, and they don't live under democracy. There's certainly a big difference between Palestinians who are citizens of Israel than Palestinians who are living in the occupied West Bank or under Hamas rule in Gaza, which is controlled by Israel. The borders are controlled by Israel and Egypt, and supplies and everything controlled by Israel. We don't have democracy in the sense where we have a population that lives in equality or has an equal opportunity or even has equal laws. Palestinians living in the West Bank live under a completely different legal system than Jews living in the West Bank. Israeli Arabs are under the same legal system as in Israel as Jews are, but there is systemic discrimination against them. There is no equality. And we have the Israeli government, which passed the nation state law, which officially made it legal to give privileges to Jews, to recognize Israel as the Jewish state only, and not recognize that the state should be a state of equality for all of its citizens. And then, of course, we have the Gaza Strip with 2.3 or 2.4 million people living in an open-air prison ruled by an authoritarian Islamic fundamentalist regime that's cut off from the world, on one side by Israel, the other side by Egypt, and Israel controls the access from the sea.
So this is what we've heard increasingly over the last few years, is that because of the situation that you've described, many Palestinians have given up the idea of a Palestinian state. And in actual fact, they see the two-state solution as facilitating this apartheid system in which you can say, look, you Palestinians live in this little area here. We're going to have ultimate control over the area. But you can get on with your lives there in a small and limited way. And essentially, it's like a Bantustan within South Africa. And Israel has expanded to such extent, and I know this is your analysis within the West Bank, that the viability of a Palestinian state seems incredibly limited.
Right.
Also, in terms of the political analysis, it would seem to me that in actual fact, Hamas is pretty popular among poorer communities, and that certainly when it comes to Fatah, when it comes to the Palestinian Authority, among the sort of more urban, educated people, there's no legitimacy in places like Ramallah, in those sort of urban centers. And so this points to me, it's a very, very different direction. So how do what's your version, what's your vision for this two-state solution when both on the ground and practical matters, and also politically, it just seems there's no possibility, it's not possible.
Right. So let me start off by saying that I've been an advocate of the two-state solution since I was a teenager. I wrote my first op-ed piece in favor of two-state solution in 1975. That's how long I've been at this, supporting a two-state solution. In my vision of a two-state solution, there was to be a Palestinian state in the occupied territories, those territories occupied by Israel in 1967, West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, with open borders between the Palestinian state and Israel, with going back to the vision that was planted in the UN Partition Resolution of 1947, where there would be two states with a shared economy, with Jerusalem being an open shared capital of two states, based on a model of real cross-boundary cooperation, not on the vision that emerged through the Oslo peace process of two states with walls and fences that separate them, that keep Palestinians and Israelis isolated from them and keep Palestinians poor. That can never be a recipe for peace, and that's what I've been advocating against all these years that I continue to support a two-state solution. The reality on the ground is that the viability of a equitable two-state solution today is almost nil. I'm not sure that it can be saved. It might be able to save it. We certainly don't have the leaders in Israel nor in Palestine that are willing to negotiate it, that can negotiate it, and we lack leadership of the kind of statesmanship that Nelson Mandela and de Klerk demonstrated in South Africa when South Africa came to its senses. We're still in a period of insanity here, and during that period of insanity, we seem to be moving further and further away from the possibility of a two-state solution. That's not to say that there's a possibility for a one-state solution. It is to say that the discourse on the Palestinian side, particularly amongst young Palestinians, is moved away from the nationalist discourse of an independent Palestinian state and much more to the discourse of rights. Give us our rights.
Absolutely. Okay. I've got tons of questions, but I've got to allow other people to start bringing them in. So we'll bring Hookie Walker up in just a second. So Sahara Walker, we'll just bring him up in a second. We have to bring, it takes a second to bring that up. So what is that one person, one vote in a unified state? Does that mean you no longer can, essentially, that's what Zionism is about, it's a Jewish state, and that's what you believe in profoundly. That's essentially why you moved from the states to Israel.
Right. So I think that this notion that Israel can be the democratic nation state of the Jewish people and control all the land and all the people here is impossible. It can't be. Which means that we currently have an apartheid reality. We have a binational one political entity reality between the river and Gaza and a separate Islamic entity in Gaza. I think that we have to look for hybrid models between a confederation and a federation and see how you can create zones of autonomy where people, because what this conflict has been about is a willingness to fight, to die, and to kill for a territorial expression of identity. People want a piece of land that they can call their own. So we may have to create zones of autonomous identity that are in contiguous territories with open borders, but in places where people can express their identity religiously, nationally, ethnically, culturally, and enable people to have a sense that they control their identity. I'm not sure that the South Africa solution is one that will ever work here. And I think the intercommunal violence that we've seen this past week points us to the fact how dangerous it might be to try and create some kind of artificial one person, one vote, one state reality. At this point, we're not ready for that.
Okay, let's take the question from Hookie Walker, and I'll come back to you about not being ready for one person, one vote. Go ahead, Hookie.
Yeah, thank you very much. Wasn't that the most brilliant presentation, including all sorts of things we don't get in the UK press, like the total moral incompetence of the Palestinian leadership? And my question may be thought of as a bit of a side issue, but I've been really surprised how little we've heard from the Jordanians, either about the proposed evictions of people from properties that they negotiated for Palestinians years and years ago, or more important perhaps, the regime supposed to govern the Al-Aqsa Mosque area. Does the speaker know why the Jordanians appear to have been so silent?
I have to say this is perhaps facile, but this is one of my favorite Scrabble words. It's allowed in Scrabble. WAQF, W-A-Q-F.
So I don't think the Jordanians have been silent. Actually, I think their voices are being heard loud and clear behind the scenes. In fact, this case in the High Court, it was actually started because the Jordanians made available to the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah the land documents that proved that it was the Jordanian government that gave them the rights to the land before 1967. So the Jordanians have been playing an active role in providing documentation for proof of ownership. And the Jordanian government is also actually responsible for the Waqf. When the Temple Mount Al-Aqsa is quiet, it is as a result of those quiet behind the scenes open communication between the Israeli police and the Waqf officials. When it goes off the rails and we have an explosion of violence, the Israeli police enter the compound and take control. The Waqf are not armed. They don't have the ability to confront the Israeli police. They have little ability to control the violence once the young people go up there to throw stones at the police. But it has been extremely severe Jordanian protest to Israel with regard to the compound that is being heard very loudly by Israel. The problem is that Israel, the Netanyahu regime, has belittled the Jordanian government. There hasn't been a meeting between King Abdullah and Netanyahu in years. And in fact, just before Ramadan, the crown prince, Abdullah's eldest son, was scheduled to make a visit to the holy places in Jerusalem. And he was coming with his own entourage of guards, and the Israelis prevented his crossing into the West Bank because they didn't agree to the prince coming with his own guards. And this was a direct slap in the face to King Abdullah and his son, the crown prince. That visit didn't take place. And it's just an indication of the bad relations between Israel and Jordan in the years that Netanyahu is prime minister.
Thanks, illuminating. Thank you.
Great, excellent. I don't know if George Muir is about to serenade us or ask a question. Go ahead, George.
I'll unmute myself. That's right. No, I put it away. It sounds like a bit of an obvious question, please. What is the long-term thinking of the Israeli government in Israel? I'm sure they are not, in truth, just lurching from week to week. There must be some long-term vision, whether we like it or not. What do you think that is, please?
I think the long-term vision is the one I mentioned earlier, that in my view, this 9 days, 10 days of war has led to an enormous victory for Netanyahu in achieving everything that he's wanted to. Let's just look at what's been achieved here. One is that Netanyahu succeeded in having Abbas cancel the elections because of the threat that Hamas might actually win. Netanyahu has foiled the attempt of an alternative government to be created in Israel, because while Israel is at war, the right-wing elements within the potential coalition withdrew themselves from the game. Netanyahu has brought about this war has brought about the intercommunal violence between Jews and Arabs in Israel, which has pushed the possibility of Arab political parties joining an Israeli government coalition. One second, I see your hand. We have led to riots in the West Bank and brought Hamas back to shooting rockets at Israel. Now, from Netanyahu's point of view, what this has done is enabled him to continue to say that we have no partner for peace on the Palestinian side. which is what Netanyahu wants to do. The long-term strategy of Netanyahu is to keep the Palestinians under autonomy, as he calls it, which means under the rule of a collaborative Palestinian Authority without negotiating any long-term agreements that would require Israel to withdraw from territories and create a Palestinian state. The whole game here, from Netanyahu's point of view, is not having a Palestinian state created between the river and the sea.
It seems to me, seems to me that Hamas gave Netanyahu a gift.
Oh, the biggest cooperation that exists in the Middle East today is between Hamas and Netanyahu.
Yeah, so what that does seem like, you know, like really quite short-term tactical maneuvers.
No, it's long-term.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, let me continue. Quite clearly, you indicate a long-term aim, which is to keep a sort of suppressed, quiescent Palestinian community. Now, does the thinking, and that I suppose could go on for 50 years, I don't know, you know, but does the thinking extend anywhere beyond just keeping them suppressed?
Well,
you know,
it does. Look at the collaboration between Trump and Netanyahu. The Abraham Accords leading to peace between Israel and 4 additional Arab countries. And of course, the jewel of the crown that everyone was waiting for is Saudi Arabia. And if Saudi Arabia would normalize relations with Israel or even enter into a peace agreement with Israel, it would, from the Israeli point of view, bury the Palestinian issue. Palestinians are not very popular in the Middle East, as you know, you must know. And a lot of people around the region were quite happy to see the Palestinian issue buried by the developing of relations between Israel and the Arab Gulf. It's a lot about money. It's a lot about business and commerce and high tech that Israel has to offer and to integrate with the rest of the region. And the game was also thought that the Palestinians could be led to be an acquiescent population by simply boosting the economy. Netanyahu has been talking for 10 years about economic peace, not about political peace. Let's give them more food, let's give them more jobs, let's give them more opportunities. The young people in Palestine, in Ramallah, don't want to go and be killed for the flag. They would rather have a job and a career and a family and a house. This is the thinking behind the whole thing.
Okay, let's hold that thought just for a moment. I'm going to come to Rebecca Gill, and we're just going to talk about what's going on with the current conflict in Gaza, and then we'll come back to those issues of, you know, essentially what is the future for young Palestinians? What is the future? What kind of state are people thinking about? Rebecca, go ahead with your question. Good to see you, by the way.
Hi, hello. So it's Rebecca and Liam, my husband from Sydney, Australia. Hope you can hear me. Gershon, good to see you again. We traveled with you in 2019.
We're losing your voice.
We're losing your voice. So just speak up, Rebecca. Just keep speak up because it's quite soft to sound.
We traveled in Israel and the West Bank on the second election, the eve of the second election, and we're now just wondering, how has the West responded in the last 10 days? We've seen Biden and the US stand back and hesitate. There's been, you know, lots of media attention, but not.
Yeah. So just how would you assess, Gershon, the West response? There's the European Union, there's the US, there's Biden. Give us an assessment.
So 2 things. One is that the West, the United States, and most of the countries in Europe have stated outwardly that Israel has the right to defend itself. 3,500 rockets have been shot by the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad on the Israeli civilian population, putting millions of Israelis into the shelters and in harm's way. This is a crime, a war crime. There's no question about it that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are targeting the civilian population. They're also targeting strategic sites, but mainly aimed at killing Israelis. So the West has given Israel a carte blanche, more or less, to do what it's doing. And I would note, and I think this is being noted by Israel, that given more than 3,700 bombing missions by the Israeli Air Force over a very small territory of Gaza, the fact that there are only 200 plus dead is quite remarkable, actually. When you think about the war of 2014, there were thousands of people killed. And that was with a ground operation in Gaza. So if Israel can do 3,700 bombings in Gaza, there's a lot of damage to real estate, to property, to roads, to infrastructure. But the number of casualties is actually quite small. And I think that's awarded Israel extra days of fighting. The pressure is beginning to happen. There's more and more pressure on Israel behind the scenes and in the media, and of course from civil society, to end this bombing. I'm not sure that Israel has determined the point when it's ready to stop. It can certainly continue for a while, bombing Gaza and hitting more targets. The second thing I want to say is that the double talk of many of these Western countries who in their UN interventions the other day in the Security Council also mentioned the continued support for a two-state solution, while almost none of them have recognized the state of Palestine. I think if the international community wants to keep alive the possibility of a two-state solution, the only way that that's going to be possible, and I hardly ever use the word only way, but the only way it's probably possible to keep the two-state solution alive is if these countries in the West begin to recognize the state of Palestine. If we have a two-state solution, what's the other state? Everyone recognizes Israel. And I'll remind everyone that Israel is a state with no permanent borders. Israel's borders were never recognized by the international community. So why can't we recognize a Palestinian state without permanent borders and tell these two countries they have to negotiate a border between them? But the first thing that needs to be done is given recognition of the Palestinian right to self-determination and the right to a state. And then we can talk about a two-state solution.
Yeah, I guess the reality is there's not much of a state to recognize, just in practical terms.
But maybe if they
I take your point.
Negotiate it.
Yeah, I take your point. Gerald, thank you very much, Rebecca. Well, there'll be opportunities to have follow-up questions, so do stay with us if you asked a question. We can come back to you. Geraldine Gill in Houston, Texas. What time is it there, Jerry? You need to open your microphone, otherwise we can't hear you.
6:30?
6:30.
Oh,
only for you, Gershon.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Because is this ensuring Netanyahu's return to the presidency?
Prime Minister. Yeah.
Prime Minister, not president, but
Prime Minister, yeah.
We are probably heading for a fifth round of elections. Mr. Lapid, who was given the mandate from the Israeli president to form a government, has, I think, 15 days left to form a government. The chances are very slim that he'll be able to do that. Then it will go back to the Knesset for a period of 21 days. And if the Knesset can't get behind one person with 61 votes behind that one person, we automatically go to another round of new elections around 3 months, 4 months after that. So sometime in probably October, we would have the fifth round of election. During all that time, Netanyahu remains the transitional prime minister. So yes, he gets to continue to be prime minister without having a majority in the government, without having support from the people, without having a mandate. And this is the ideal situation for Netanyahu, who, like Mahmoud Abbas, I would comment, rules by decree and not so much by democracy.
Gershon, I want to come back to the bigger picture now. I just want to ask you a personal question. This is really about you and your feelings. How would you be ready to accept a state that wasn't a Jewish state? I mean, this is what you gave up your life in the States for, you moved to. Is there a point at which you realize, look, this just can't work?
Well, I've been saying for years that Israel needs to change its definition from the democratic nation state of the Jewish people to the democratic nation state of the Jewish people and all of its citizens. And I've been saying this for decades. When I first moved here, my first 2 years of living in Israel, I lived in a Palestinian Arab village in Israel doing community work. And it was from then where I came to understand firsthand the discrimination against the Arab citizens of Israel. And I said to myself, how could Gershon, who just moved here from America, be more of an Israeli than my neighbor Mahmoud, who's been living in this country documented for 300, 400, 500 years? It's just not logical. So I've always believed that Israel can be the nation state of the Jewish people, but it also has to be the state of all of its citizens. The problem is when Israel is in an existential war with the Palestinian people, because Mahmoud is not only an Israeli citizen, he's also a Palestinian. So he's in a situation where his state is at war with his people, which inevitably leads to the reality of the Palestinian citizens of Israel being viewed as potential fifth columns, suspects, being more loyal to their people than to their state. So I've always believed that there couldn't be true democracy and equality in Israel until we had a resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And the way that I thought that that could happen is if there's an independent Palestinian state. The Palestinian citizens of Israel could be like American Jews or British Jews. They can identify with their nation state, but be citizens, equal citizens wherever they're living, even if that's in part of historic Palestine. Today, that doesn't seem like it's going to happen. And I think the first order of business for us in this country is equality. And the issue of what we call it is less important to me than the reality of all the citizens having equality here. And by the way, Nicholas, I stopped calling myself a Zionist. You introduced me as a Zionist. I don't call myself a Zionist anymore simply because I don't know what it means.
When did that happen? When did that happen? I found that fascinating. When did you stop?
I came out of the closet, so to speak, about 6 months ago, and I wrote this in my Jerusalem Post column.
Wow.
But I no longer call myself a Zionist because
I think that's a really, really significant thing. And I think I doubt that the vast majority of Israelis are going to follow you on that.
No, they don't.
That shift is that sense of incompatibility is what fascinates me.
Well, I still think that if nationalism is legitimate in the world and peoples have the right to self-determination, to have a territorial expression of their identity, then I think the Jewish people have that right as well. So I'm not non-Zionist in that sense. I just don't know what Zionism is when so many horrible things are done in the name of Zionism. When there's a terrorist attack and settlers come out and say that the Zionist answer to terrorism is building more settlements, then I say we've gone off the rails, we're crazy. This is not Zionism. The Zionist enterprise was an enormously successful project, perhaps one of the most successful political projects in the history of the world. But we achieved those goals in 1948. We don't need the world Zionist movement anymore. We need a democratic government of Israel. That's what we need.
Okay. I want to get more questions. There's some particular groups in Australia I know have joined for this call. I'd love to get some questions from you. I know you've signed up for this talk to hear these views. Gershon, the vast majority of Israelis don't agree with you. You are in a tiny, tiny minority. Looking at opinion polls, many Israelis would prefer to see a Jewish state over a democratic state. Just describe how peace is such a dirty word among ordinary Israelis.
Well, I think that we've moved away. There's a pendulum that moves in areas of conflict, and the movement of the pendulum is often in conflict zones, that the further away you move from peace, the more religious the society becomes. And I think that's evident both in Israel and in Palestine. Since we have moved away from the possibility of peace from the year 2000 until today, both Israel and Palestine have become more religious, more conservative, more tribal. We see that more and more in Israel, but it's also evident to the fact that no one is talking about peace in a realistic terms. I think this could be very fluid. If we actually had statesmen, stateswomen standing up and talking about negotiations again, getting back to a peace process, I think we would see public opinions swinging back. Because the majority of Israelis and Palestinians realize that we're not going anywhere. Israelis are not leaving, Palestinians are not leaving. These two people are living here between the river and the sea. We have to find a way to live together, whether it be 1 state, 2 states, 3 states, or 10 states. We have to figure out how to do it because no one is giving up their rights to be here.
I think what's perhaps depressing, and this is the reality facing one in the face, is that if you're talking about a rights movement, like a civil rights movement, we know with the legacy of slavery in the United States, that's not a direct parallel, but it's a kind of parallel, that this kind of thing takes decades, if not a century, if not a very, very long period of time. So are these issues that are going to be, I'm asking you to look at a crystal ball here. This is going to be a very, very long evolutionary process.
Right. In Judaism, we say that prophecy was given to the fools. So I'm not sure I want to be a fool and be a prophet, but assessing the reality is that we're in a very long process here. There's been so much damage done within Israel between Jews and Arabs that will take a long time to repair. I think there will actually be a very positive response. We're beginning to see it in communities where leaders are coming together and mayors of local towns are coming together. There was a viral video that's going out on the social media today of a meeting that took place between 10 local government leaders. There's the Women's Wage Peace Movement in Israel, which has 60,000 members, which is organizing joint Jewish-Arab demonstrations. So I think there will be a positive upshoot of communities also coming together and say this violence does not represent us. But the damage has been done. On the Israeli-Palestinian track, look, nothing is going to change until we have new leaders on both sides. On all sides, Israel, Hamas, the Palestinian Authority. The current leadership is not going to be the ones moving us forward. In the meantime, we're going to need civil society actions, NGOs, peace NGOs working together, peace education programs, all kinds of grassroots activities. That can keep a flame of hope burning, but it's not going to be decisive until we have a leadership that decides that we need to do something real to make this happen.
In a moment, I want to talk to you about Israel's relationship with the United States, how that's possibly changing, in which directions we're seeing sort of multiple directions there possibly. But Simon Jackson's got a good question first of all, so we'll take Simon next. Go ahead, Simon.
Not me.
It's actually from me.
Oh, Annie McMahon. I always say it's Annie disguised with a beard.
And thanks very much for taking the question. You have just given me, I've been dying to ask this question for ages. I moved to a predominantly Jewish high school in 1973 when I was a teenager, obviously. And my classmates explained to me that a Zionist was a Jew who believed in the establishment of the state of Israel, and an anti-Zionist was a Jew who didn't believe that this was the time, and, for example, objected to the use of Hebrew as national language. And it seems that the term, as we use it now, has evolved a great deal, but I would be kind of interested to understand more about anti-Zionists within the Jewish community, because the description I was given in 73, which was, of course, after the 67 war, recent, and very much framed the way they described it.
Okay,
if this is really changed.
You could, I know you could go on this one, Gershon, for ages. This is, Hasidim politics. Give us a very short version of that if you can.
I would say basically there are two kinds of anti-Zionist amongst Jews. One, like my great-grandfather and great-grandmother who immigrated to Palestine in the 1920s, they were ultra-Orthodox Jews who were anti-Zionist. They didn't believe that Jews should take God's rule into their own hands and their own destiny. They came to die in the Holy Land, to be buried in the Holy Land, not to live in the Holy Land. And they didn't believe that Zionism was right. They thought it was blasphemous. It was against the will of God. The other kind of anti-Zionist are the political anti-Zionist who believe that Zionism is a colonialist, imperialist movement that usurps the rights from the native Palestinian people living here, and believe that it's unjust and should not be allowed. And that's basically the division of the two kind of anti-Zionists. I think that it's gone more now because the Israeli government and the Jewish establishment, particularly in the United States, has made equivalent anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. If you're anti-Israel in the eyes of the Israeli government and the Jewish establishment in the West, in America in particular, then you're anti-Semitic, because if you don't recognize the rights of the Jewish people to have a state themselves, then you're not anti-Zionist, you're not anti-something political, you're anti-Semitic. And of course, this is very dangerous in my view, because there is anti-Semitism, which is completely illegitimate, and objecting to the state of Israel or to what the state of Israel does is not anti-Semitic. It might be, but it's political. And it's very dangerous to call something anti-Semitic, which is not legitimate, to criticizing Israel, which is totally legitimate.
I believe you me, we had our most explosive webinar this year on that very subject. So we've gone into that in some detail. Really, really good question, Annie. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to come to Anna Logan in just a second, but I do want to, and there's Yuri Vintis just popped up on the screen too. So we've got plenty of questions there. So let me take Anna first, because you're there, and then I'll the question I was going to ask is about the relationship with the US, but let's take Anna first.
Yes, this is a personal question. I had hoped to be on a visit with Political Tours last year, and then perhaps this year, maybe it'll be next year, to Palestine and Israel. And in Israel, I hope to meet up with a cousin that I've discovered I have there. And I wondered, Gershon, if you knew him, because he's a left-wing journalist. His name is Igal Sarna.
Sure. I don't know him personally. I know of him. I read him in Haaretz newspaper. I think he's also, he hasn't been based in Sweden in the last years.
Ah, I didn't know that. There, you know more about my family than I do.
I think he was based in Stockholm for a number of years. Maybe he's still there. I'm not sure. But I do see his name in the newspaper from time to time. I don't think we've actually met.
Okay, Anna, thank you for that. I'm going to take Yuri now, and I'll hold my question in reserve. Go ahead, Yuri. Microphone, Yuri. Microphone.
Sorry about that. I should know better by now. I'm going back to a very famous speech that President Rivlin made, where he identified Israel now almost irretrievably breaking up into 4 tribes: the Israeli Arab, the ultra-Orthodox Haredi, the secular, and the religious nationalists / settlers. And I think at the end, he added the diasporic Jewish community as the 5th tribe. And the question really is that if there's paralysis in Israel, which is kind of demonstrated, if you like, by 4 successive inconclusive elections, what's the role of the diaspora communities in trying to contribute some sanity to the process?
Apologies for the connection to Bertie the dog.
I really don't know. I mean, if the diaspora communities could come here and be citizens and vote, we would have a change of the outcome of the elections, and we'd probably have a saner government, a more liberal, open, democratic government being elected. But because they don't have the right to vote here, their potential influence on what goes on here is actually very limited. Of course, the American Jewish community influences deeply within the Democratic Party. In the United States, this gets to Nicholas's question about the role of the United States here. And of course, we are seeing significant changes in the Biden administration with a growing majority of Democrats, both in civil society and within Congress, of taking a critical view of Israel and the continued occupation, and even a significant numbers of members of Congress talking about conditioning Israeli military aid to human rights issues and issues of the occupation and building settlements, etc. So this is actually a very swift change from what we saw during the Trump years, when those voices were silenced, and now they are the prevalent voices within the American political scene. And I think that the Jewish community in America, look, my experience with the Jewish community in America is as someone who, before the pandemic, lectured on American college campuses. And most of the young Jews who I met on campuses, if they supported Israel, they represented the right wing of the population of the student body. From J Street, that for most young Jews on college campuses, Israel was not an issue of concern at all. They didn't even think about Israel. And those that did were mostly critical of Israel. Those supporting the right-wing view of Israel amongst the young American Jewish population are a minority, I think. And that's going to have an impact on the diaspora, the largest diaspora community in the United States for years to come. The relationship that was based on the memory of the Holocaust of their grandparents isn't there amongst them. And they're looking at the state of Israel in 21st century terms of a country with occupation and no democracy and violation of human rights, and they're critical of that. The emotional sentiment and the fear of a Holocaust is not what guides their thinking.
but that doesn't translate into a sense of pressure in Israel.
No, I don't think so. I think that the diaspora, Israel is no longer dependent on the US financial aid, nor the aid that it receives from the American Jewish community. Israel is an economic power. While Israel never says no to contributions, it's not dependent on that money like it was in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. Israel's in a completely different economic space today. So the ability to leverage, support, influence the diaspora is quite limited these days.
I dropped out for probably the entirety of that answer. So I missed that. Just in terms of what's happening at the moment, just in the immediate, in the next sort of year or so, what interest does the Biden administration have in dealing with Israel? And this is, at the moment we see Biden fix almost completely on a domestic agenda, and it's risk management, isn't it, Israel and Palestine?
Right. I think it would be insane for Biden at this point to try and initiate a new Israeli-Palestinian peace process. He has so many domestic problems that he has to deal with, and so much healing and fixing of the damage that was done during the Trump years that he has to focus on. And he's actually done quite an amazing job, if you ask me. I'm so surprised, pleasantly surprised by the kind of actions that Biden has taken, both with regard to the COVID pandemic and vaccinations, and of course with the economy, and really swift changes. So, and I think that's the focus, and that's going to be the focus. Also rebuilding the alliance with NATO and Europe, and figuring out what to do with China and Russia. These are much bigger problems than Israel-Palestine. I think it's essential that the Biden administration appoint a new ambassador in Israel, that they appoint a consul general to go back dealing with the Palestinians. They're reinstating aid to the Palestinian Authority and to UNRWA, which is very important. I think they need to play a much bigger role in the quartet and in the United Nations with regard to the issue of Israel-Palestine. I would be much happier with more of an internationalization of the role of the United States within an international framework rather than a sole responsibility vis-a-vis Israel. And I think we've lost Nicholas again.
I think we have, but I think he'll be back on very shortly, Gershon. Perhaps we can take Barbara's question while we wait for Nicholas to come back on. Barbara?
Hello, yes. None of us expected to see the end of apartheid in South Africa in our lifetimes. And then suddenly it happened. For a variety of reasons that were building up towards it, I realized, but it was sudden in a way. And I just wondered if you could speculate what might be a similar extraordinary moment or prompt that could see the same happen in Palestine, Israel.
Right. Well, if we remember back to what happened in South Africa, the de Klerk government actually started engaging Nelson Mandela while he was still in prison. And they were having unofficial negotiations going on before they decided to release him and bring South Africa into a new era. That's exactly the similar kind of things that needs to happen here. There needs to be a secret direct channel of talks taking place between Israel and Hamas on one side. There needs to be engagement of people like Marwan Barghouti, who's viewed by many Palestinians as being the most senior Palestinian leader in Israeli prison. He's been in prison since 2002, and he's serving 5 life sentences plus 40 years for his responsibility for leading the Second Intifada. I have recommended over and over again to different Israeli politicians that they should try to engage Marwan Barghouti while he's in prison, just as the South African government did with Nelson Mandela. And I'm saying that Marwan Barghouti is a Nelson Mandela. I think that Nelson Mandela exceeds Marwan Barghouti by enormous heights in his moral compass. But he is the kind of leader that Israel negotiated with before the Second Intifada, and he's the kind of leader who could succeed Mahmoud Abbas and support a peace process. But that needs to be primed. It needs to be worked on. They need to talk while he's in prison, and they need to engage that level of leadership. Those are the people who are viewed as heroes in Palestinian society today, those who are in prison. So those are the kind of people who, if I were a leader, that's what I would be doing, is talking to them off the record, behind the scenes, with the understanding that they will be released from prison and they will lead Palestine into a new era of peace discussions with Israel.
Gershon, I'm back. Apologies for dropping out there. It's been fantastic, a really good discussion. We've got a break now. If you're able to stay on for a few minutes after the break, that would be wonderful, because I know there are many more questions that people could ask you. Gershon, thank you so much. What did I miss out on when I dropped out?
No, you know it all. It's okay.
Okay, great. I just want to come back to that question of the political capital that Biden might use. I mean, what you talked about, what's happening among young Democrats, but what do you see within the party at the moment? There's no interest in getting involved now. It's just a standing back on the sidelines.
Right, I think that they need to be more engaged. And as I said, it's essential that he appoints a new ambassador already, that they reinstate the consulate general in Jerusalem that was responsible for formal American relations with the Palestinian Authority. That's essential. I've also commented to a number of people that I think the victory picture that I would like to see at the outcome of this war that we're facing is engagement by the United States and European Union members with Hamas directly. I know of European diplomats who travel to Gaza. Part of their responsibility is dealing with the Palestinians in Gaza. They would love to have official talks with Hamas officials in Gaza, the political people, not the military people, but they're prohibited from doing that because Hamas is a terrorist organization according to European Union law. So I think that we need to understand that Hamas is a political entity which is there to stay. And
it's quite a sort of pragmatic and politically savvy organization, despite what I think is it might seem like an enormous error now. But when you do meet with them, and I've met with them in Gaza, and I should say that we've met with people in Hezbollah and in Lebanon. If you want to understand the other side, you do need to meet and discuss them. Whether it's officially or unofficially, you have to have some kind of engagement to see what's going on.
Exactly. So I mean, this is what Hadi Amir, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Biden administration, was the envoy that Biden sent here. He met with Netanyahu. He met with Mahmoud Abbas. He went over to Jordan and met with King Abdullah. The only party he didn't talk to is Hamas. How is that possible that you can work out a ceasefire without talking to one of the parties to the war? And Hadi Amar is an Arab. He speaks Arabic. He can engage Hamas in their own language. And it's in a time that we begin to talk to people that we don't talk to.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's bring in a couple more questions. We've got Barbara Clark, whose hand is raised. Go ahead, Barbara, with your question.
It's a follow-up. Well, it follows from that and from my earlier question. Obviously, Netanyahu's not going to be having behind-the-scenes talks with any of the Palestinian players or Barghouti or whoever. But is there anybody in the Israeli political scene, in the Knesset or not in the Knesset, who might do that and might even start in opposition to have those?
Gershon, can you also talk about the Israeli Arab parties? There are two parties there, and for the first time, people were saying, right, they've got to be part of a coalition government, and this really does represent a fairly big shift in Israeli politics, because that's been taboo for decades.
So let me just say, with regard to Netanyahu, in 2006, after the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit was abducted and held in captivity by Hamas in Gaza, I personally opened up a secret back channel of talks with Hamas. In April 2011, my secret back channel with Hamas became the official negotiating channel with Hamas that was authorized by Netanyahu himself, who allowed a senior Mossad officer, who I reported to have us negotiate the release of the Israeli soldier through a secret direct back channel between myself and a senior leader of Hamas. So Netanyahu actually did this in the past. In past governments, there were members of Knesset who were visiting Marwan Barghouti regularly in prison and talking to him. And these were people from the Israeli government who had participated in informal track 2 talks that I myself had organized all before 2000 and even past 2000 with members of the Fatah leadership that Marwan Barghouti represents. Today, no one is talking to him. I don't see anyone on the political horizon, as long as Netanyahu is in power, who is willing to risk engaging these people directly. I did sit in a room in the Ministry of Defense several months ago talking about the prisoner exchange that we need to make. There are the bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers that are in Gaza since 2014, and there are 2 Israeli civilians who are presumed to be alive who are in Gaza and being held by Hamas now for 6 years, an Israeli Ethiopian and a Bedouin citizen, both who are known to be mentally ill, who crossed into Gaza by themselves. And Israeli and Hamas have been negotiating for their release for 6 years now. I actually sat in a room in the Ministry of Defense and picked up the phone and called someone in Hamas. I wanted someone who was in charge of the negotiations to speak directly, but they of course wouldn't. But they listened to me talk to someone in Hamas. That was a step forward, and this is all a kindergarten game, it sounds like to me.
Yeah, it's so tragic when we don't hear anything about the 2 Israeli civilians and and their state.
They have very little social capital because one is an Ethiopian and the other is a Bedouin Muslim, and they're both mentally ill. So it's not like Gilad Shalit, who's a white Ashkenazi son of war heroes, etc. It's a whole different game.
Yeah, Gershon, can you deal with that aspect about dealing with the Arab-Israeli parties,
right,
as they're called, and how that taboo is being broken, and interestingly, an Islamist party as well?
Yeah, the United Arab List actually split into 2 political parties, with the Islamic list separating from the list that was mainly based on the communist and Palestinian nationalist. And they broke away because they said that they don't want to put the emphasis on the Palestinian issue, on the occupation, that they wanted to deal with civil issues. They wanted to be sitting at the decision-making table. They wanted to get a share of the budgets. They wanted to improve the situation of life for the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And therefore they were willing to, if not sit at the government table, then at least negotiate the support of the government from outside the coalition, heading a committee, an important committee in the Knesset or something of that sort, but being part of the decision-making process. And that changed the game of politics, because until this time, it was viewed on the Jewish side of the political map as being illegitimate to even consider having the Arab parties support the government from outside the coalition. And Mahmoud Mansour Abbas, is the name of the leader of this party, has changed the rules of the game, actually, until the war in Gaza. But he's still saying that he's not willing to, the thought was that an Arab party could support the government by absenting itself from the Knesset at the time of the vote of confidence, simply leaving the plenary and not participating in the vote. And Mr. Mansour Abbas said, no, we are either going to vote in favor of the government or we're going to vote against the government. We're not being absent players. We are players in this game. And for the first time in the history of Israel in 73 years, there's an Arab political party which is being taken seriously as a potential coalition partner.
And they could be even bigger. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that the Arab Israelis do not vote in as large numbers as Jewish Israelis, and that they
Right.
represent 20% of the population, so they could even have a bigger representation in the Knesset.
For sure. At the high point after the third elections, they had 15 seats. Now I think in this last election, they got 12 seats. There's also the party that I traditionally vote for, Meretz, which we've been pushing to become a Jewish-Arab joint party. And of the 5 members of Knesset from Meretz now, or 6, 2 of them are Arabs. An Arab woman and an Arab man are sitting in the Knesset representing Meretz, which is traditionally a leftist Zionist party. But there's a group of us within Meretz who have been pushing for Meretz to become a fully joint party, 50-50, with joint chair people at the head of the party, a Jewish chairperson and a Palestinian Arab chairperson.
Yeah, I want to get some more thoughts from Yuri Vint here. Yuri, you coordinate, you publish in Australia, and you've got a lot of contact with the diaspora groups there. So I just want to get a few more thoughts on what we've been discussing so far, and if you've got any additional questions, Yuri.
Thanks, Nicholas. I must say I find myself with enormous agreement with everything Gershon said and his analysis. The only comment I'd make is that the thinking is that there are three wars taking place at present. There's the Israeli-Hamas war, there is the Israeli-Arab, Israeli-Jew war, and there's the Hamas-Fatah war. And it seems like Hamas has won its war with Fatah. I mean, it seems to be the great defender. And the only thing that, from a diaspora point of view, that I've been involved in is promoting people-to-people activity like eco-peace, COMET-ME, women's wage peace, so that the people-to-people relationship changed the facts of the ground in much the same way that occurred in Ireland. And in fact, the Americans made their major contribution by creating the International Fund for Ireland, several $100 million over 20 years.
$1.5 billion.
I'm sorry for being so modest. And which created over 20 years a level of trust and communications and so on, so that as soon as the Good Friday Agreement was signed, there were immediate provocations, drive-by shootings and the like, and none of it took, hold. And to America's credit, they have, in December, passed a bit of a legislation called the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, and they achieved that in December under Trump, and they achieved that act as part of the budget, and $250 million has been allocated to that, which they hope to leverage by international community adding the same or more, with the intent purpose, two streams, to create economic cooperation, new facts on the ground, and to foster that civil society and people-to-people type activity. To my way of thinking, that represents a ray of hope, and it's the way in which diaspora communities in supporting, if Israelis and Palestinians can work together on that basis over there, we in diaspora should be able to do the same here. And that's changing the diaspora narrative as much as changing the local narrative. That's my mission.
Great. Just as you said, I was part of the initiative that launched this International Fund for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. It was launched by our group called ALMEP, the Alliance for Middle East Peace. It's ALLMEP.org. ALMEP exactly took up the International Fund as Ireland as the example that we presented both to the US Congress and around the world. And the thinking behind the American who took the lead on it now is that there would be, in fact, $250 million a year made available for Israeli-Palestinian peace building, where $50 million would come from the US, $50 million would come from the European Union, $50 million would come from the Arab world, another $50 million would come from other countries, and another $50 million would come from private sector contributions. Well, this is actually the thinking in creating this grand plan for the International Fund for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. I understand the British Parliament voted in support of the idea of British contribution to the International Fund. I don't know where it's moving ahead, but ALMEP actually has a European official. In fact, the Director General of ALMEP is from Ireland, John Linden, and he's living in Paris, and he heads ALMEP now, and he's leading this international effort to advance the International Fund. The American funding will come available in budget year 2022, the first $50 million. The American Biden administration has renewed their US aid contribution of $9 million, which will be allocated over the next months for people-to-people projects. This is a program that the Trump administration had canceled, and the Biden administration has brought it back. I actually wrote a proposal for the USAID Conflict Mitigation and Management Program, which is what it's called, for a people-to-people project of reinstating discrete meetings between Israeli and Palestinian politicians. The European Union has a program called Partnership for Peace, and they'll be allocating over the next months about €4.5 million for people-to-people projects as well. And I submitted for the same Palestinian NGO a proposal to reinstate civil servant cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian government ministries, where no cooperation has existed since basically 2005, 2006. And there's a whole new generation of civil servants in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority who don't know each other. So the proposal that I wrote for this NGO is to reinstate those kind of meetings at the governmental level between governmental ministries.
Gershon, I don't think that people fully realize the actual reality on the ground in the West Bank. I mean, just how difficult life is for Palestinians in both in terms of economic opportunities, their ability to travel around, the degree to which their lives are restricted by, if you want to build a house, if you want to operate a business, if you want to travel anywhere, if you want to go from the north of the West Bank to the south of the West Bank, it can take 3-4 hours. It can take even longer than that with checkpoints. Whereas if you're a settler, you might do that same trip in about half an hour, 40 minutes.
Well, no, really, because part of the journey you're traveling on the same road, so you're stuck in the Palestinian traffic. Even though you might be able to cut across a checkpoint and go to the front of the line, it still take you time because there's a lot of traffic. But yeah, I think the statistic that best the difference between being a Jew and a Palestinian in the West Bank is that if you're a Jew living in the West Bank or in Israel, your life expectancy is 10 years more than if you're a Palestinian. And I think that says it all. I mean, just imagine in one territory having a gap of 10 years of life expectancy. That in my mind is just mind bewildering. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah. Yuri, when was the last time you were in the West Bank? Last time did you travel there?
Pre-COVID, must have been 2019 or thereabouts.
Okay.
Look, I just want to maybe just give you one example of how that the ULMAT grouping can be of assistance. There's an Australian member of ULMAT called Project Rosanna. There was an appeal through their kind of series of programs for ventilators because they couldn't be bought for love of money. Australia's handled COVID reasonably well. I think we might have 2 cases in Australia at the moment. And so they were able to convince the Australian government, who had orders in the front of the queue, to step back and allow the Palestinians to take the ventilators that were in the front of the queue, and Australia stepped back. Same with testing mechanism and a number of other projects. So,
it does beg the question, though, is why didn't the Israelis roll out a vaccination program for the areas they occupy? Why didn't they facilitate those hospitals with the same facilities? Why should it be down to the Australian Jewish diaspora to send it from overseas? I mean, it seems absurd to me.
I think that's a rhetorical question, Nicholas.
It's a rhetorical question. It's a rhetorical question.
We were able to lobby and put a significant amount of pressure on Israel to at least vaccinate those Palestinians who come to work in Israel. And there are more than 100,000 Palestinians who come every day into Israel to work in Israel. And for the first month of the vaccination program in Israel, they were not able to get vaccinated. And we were able to put pressure on the Israeli government to do that. And they all did get vaccinated. I tried, actually, the mayor of Jerusalem, through his advisor, approached me to try and get the Palestinians to agree to set up a vaccination center on El Aqsa compound. And I approached the Palestinian Authority about that, and the Mahmoud Abbas himself ruled that Israel would have no footprint on the El Aqsa compound, even if it was just for giving out vaccinations. And we assured them that while it would be done by the Magen David Adom, the Red Jewish Star, which is the equivalent to the Red Cross in Israel, that they would be doing the vaccinations, but all the personnel giving the vaccinations would be Palestinians. And they still would not agree. So the Palestinian Authority has not done very well by their own people. There are now vaccinations going on in Palestine, certainly much slower than in Israel. We're basically beyond the COVID epidemic in Israel. Everyone here is vaccinated, and I think starting next week, they're going to be vaccinating 12 to 16-year-olds.
Yeah, wow. Well, listen, it's been a fantastic talk. Very, very good follow-up discussion. Apologies for the rural internet connection on the Welsh borders here. I've really enjoyed it, Gershon, and learned a lot as well. So thank you very much indeed for all your time. I do hope that we can be back with you in October, possibly to do another tour. As I say, it depends on the COVID situation. I'm optimistic. I think we may be able to do it. I think this could be
Israel is open for tourism, and I think the West Bank will be by then as well.
Yeah, great. I'm really, really looking forward to it. Thanks again as well to you, Yuri, as well for your contributions.